Thank you very much for the nice introduction. Yeah, so apparently I needed an introduction. Right, so I've been looking very much forward to this, but I know that most of you are actually looking very much forward to the drinks, so I'll try to keep this within the boundaries of what I've promised. So when I was asked to give this keynote for this audience, I got extremely happy and extremely scared because I know what kind of audience you are, and I warn my speakers about it. I say they're actually extremely clever, and they ask good questions. I'll try to leave it so that there's no time for questions today. I really like Lord of the Rings, the film. I'm sorry, never read the book, really. So you can leave now if you hate me for that. But, and I think that I would like to talk about what we should have learned from Lord of the Rings when it comes to team building and other things in software development. And I think that the first thing I want to say is that often when you want to learn something, you look at people who are succeeding. It's not always a good idea. For instance, you remember that 5 a.m. club that was so much in the news, and everybody wanted to be part of the 5 a.m. club because it made everybody so successful. But then we had the book, Why We Sleep, and then we know that actually that's a really fucked up way of living, so let's not do that. And also, you know that those iPhones that some of you sit with in the hands, they are created by this wonderful man, Steve Jobs, and it's really a success story that you should learn from. But unfortunately, he was quite an asshole, right? He lied to Wozniak, he fired people in the elevator, so maybe not follow that either. So what do we do? What do we follow? So Lord of the Rings, they succeeded at the end with their project. So maybe we can learn from them. Let's take a look. But before we take a look at Lord of the Rings, please take a look at the illustrations in my presentation. They're all made by my oldest child, Maya Cornels, who is studying computer science at the moment, and as you can see, she's also an artist. And I'll skip directly to an illustration that she hasn't made, but all the others she's made. This is a picture from Denmark. And you might wonder, what's the relation between Lord of the Rings and Denmark? And some of you might know already that Tolkien was actually studying linguistics at Oxford University, and he was specialized in Scandinavian languages, and he actually was fluent in Danish. He could read and write Danish, and that's quite a feat because Danish is actually one of the hardest languages in the world to learn. There were some studies about what's the hardest language to learn, and we saw that the Danish babies are the babies that learn their language the latest in the world. And that could be like two explanations. Either Danish babies are just completely daft. I don't think that's true. Or Danish is very difficult to learn. So here's another reason to be quite impressed by Tolkien, because he actually managed to learn Danish. He was also very interested in the Viking age and the old Danish name for Viking places. And quite close to where I live in Jutland. You see there the tip of Jutland. There's a little island called Hjelm. And in between island of Hjelm and Jutland, of course, there is a Hjelm Dyb, which is a very deep part of the sea, and that's where the Viking ships could pass between Hjelm and Jutland. And quite close to that tip of Jutland is actually Isgård, which you might remember also as a name from Tolkien. Isgård, or Eisen, is the old Germanic name for iron. So Isgard or Isengard is sort of the same word. And because Denmark is so extremely flat, you probably can't see anything from this. So I tried to use some Google Maps instead, so you can see for yourself that's actually true. There's something called Hjelm Deep or Hjelm Dyb in Denmark, and here in relation we have Isgård Gods. So Hjelm's Dyb or Helm's Deep is actually from Denmark, but if you look at how it is described like Cheddar Gorge in the south of England. So he took bits and pieces, the names from Denmark and what it looked like from England. But let's go back to what we can learn here. So the first thing I want to talk about is the team building. So how did we build the team of the Fellowship of the Ring? It started off with Frodo, who inherited the ring from Bilbo, in some weird definition of inherited, and Gandalf was telling Frodo what to do with the ring. And then Sam was listening in outside the window, and because he heard so much, he had to be part of the trip as well. So Frodo and Sam went together, and they went outside of the Shire, which was the first time Sam went outside of the Shire, and he was very afraid of it. And then they met Merry and Pippin, and Merry and Pippin were stealing vegetables, and they didn't want to be caught by the farmer, so they would rather just go on this trip. They didn't know what it was, but they just went away anyway. They thought it's probably better than being told off, which they tried before. And then these 4 little hobbits, together with Gandalf, is now forming the first part of the team. They're sort of, they're trying to work out what they should do. And they are going to meet Gandalf in the Prancing Pony pub, but unfortunately, Gandalf is not there, and Merry and Pippin get very drunk. And then Frodo, in trying to save them, does something very stupid. He puts the ring on his finger, and then Strider, who we will later know as Aragorn, finds them and saves them from all the evil things that we'll talk about later. So this is how this team was built. And then they went to Rivendell, and in Rivendell they met with the other people or creatures, and they created the whole Fellowship of the Ring, and that turned into 4 hobbits, 1 wizard, 2 men, an elfish, and a dwarf. And what we see here is a weird fellowship, a weird team put together by a sort of a half-crazy wizard, half-happily. And it reminds me of a team I was at when we were doing a research project once at University of Aarhus in Denmark, where we had these PhD students, much like the hobbits, didn't really know what they were going into. And the Gandalf, the wizard, the professor, was trying to tell them what to do, and he didn't really tell them all of what they needed to do. And then they needed to work with some other people as well, because in a EU-funded project, you have to work with people from the other EU countries, even though you don't want to do it. So they're sort of forced together. I don't want to say which countries we had to work with, but I guess you can imagine. And everybody wanted to work with the Germans, but it was very difficult to be allowed. So the way that I'm going to tell this story is that I'm going to go through a little bit of Lord of the Rings, and then I'm going to talk about anecdotes that relate to that from my experience as a developer and an agile coach for about 20 years. Now, what was the focus of this project was the ring. The ring was the product. The ring was the project. And this ring was actually, it's a bit like a project handed over reluctantly from the previous project manager, Bilbo. And it was really badly documented. So Gandalf had to search, as you remember, for this documentation. And he finally found it, and it was written in a really awkward language. And they sort of had to find out along the way what the side effects of the existing project was. Frodo found out along the way, and he was not very happy about this project. As you can see in this picture, this is Frodo being not very happy. He's not thrilled, and he never really became thrilled with the project, but he didn't manage to leave the project. It was a bit like an old legacy project that you take over, and the architect has left the building many years ago, and you have to refactor it. Perhaps it's a monolith, and you have to create it into microservices, and it actually means that you have to destroy what you have already. Everything that you get is hopefully going to disappear, much like the ring. So it's a little bit like a legacy project. Now, when they met in Rivendell, Gandalf, who you can look at the CTO, told them exactly what this was about. But perhaps he was being a little too simplistic about the goal of this project. Perhaps he was explaining it in a super easy way. He just said, just pop the ring in the hot stuff and then we're done with it. It makes it sound a lot easier than it turned out to be. And also when the people or the different races were discussing they were making some sort of risk assessment about this. So you can imagine that Frodo had made some sort of feasibility study with the other hobbits to try to find out, is this even possible, and what can work and what cannot work. And then when they meet with all the others in Rivendell, they try to figure out, is it even possible? And this is where Boromir is saying that this is actually not possible at all. He's being very pessimistic and negative. You know people like that. When you try to start a project and you're like, this is going to be fine. He's like not going to be fine. It's going to be swamps. People are going to get murdered. And he actually did die as a part of this project. So he was right about that. We should listen to them. At the other end of the spectrum, we have Gimli, who's one of these grumpy old men who's like, you're stupid, this is so easy. I just take my axe and I just crush the ring. He wasn't right, of course, but he tried. It crushed his axe. So this risk assessment that takes place in Rivendell reminds me of a lot of things that takes place in software development as well. One of the places that I work in, they said that we really need to estimate exactly how long this is going to take. This was a project they expected to take 2 years, but they wanted to know exactly how many hours for every month, for every person, this should take. And I said, I'm not sure this is going to work, because it's the first time you're going to do something like this. This wasn't software in this particular case. You've never done anything like this before, and now you want to know by the hour how long it'll take. And they said, but we need to, because we already sold it to customers and we told them how much it's going to cost. So we need to know how long it'll take, how many people we need to hire, so that we know how much we're going to make on it. And I said, that's interesting. Please provide me with all the historical data about your previous estimations and how they held up in reality. And of course, they couldn't come up with any. I said, if this is weird, because if it's so important for you to know exactly how long this is going to take, then why don't you have data about how long it usually is supposed to take and how long it actually takes? But they couldn't provide me with that data. And it turned out there were several reasons for that. One reason is that when a project is done, everybody's happy. They're not looking back, a bit like in The Lord of the Rings. Once the ring was gone, everybody was happy. We don't think about poor Boromir that died and all the other things that happened, because now the users are happy. We're getting our money. Everything is fine. But another thing that I noticed was that with these estimations, people were actually cheating a lot with the estimations, right? Everybody in this room probably don't cheat with estimations, but these particular people, they were doing a bit like I did with the physics reports in high school. You know, you're making these measurements, and you know how, in theory, the graph is going to look like. So you make these measurements, and you plot these things into the graph, and it looks like shit. And you're like, oh. But what if this measurement was like this, and if this measurement was like this, then my teacher's going to be happy. And it turned out that that's what they did. So I went back to them and said, you're cheating with the estimations, and you're never looking at them again. Why do we need to estimate? And it's not because I'm pro no estimates. It's just I thought it was completely stupid, right? They said, well, that's just how it is. Okay, great, I said. And then we worked a little bit longer on this project. And I was new in this organization. I was thinking, this takes a lot longer than you imagine, right? Yes, it does. And they were all very serious, and they were all very sad. And I said, well, but tell me before I came, how did you evaluate how long this would take? Well, they said, so normally when we build something like that, it takes us 10 iterations to create it. Right, I said. But then we knew we were in a hurry, so we estimated it would be 3 iterations. And I said, but you've never done this before, right? Yeah. The thing you're building is like 50% bigger than anything you've ever built before, right? Yes. Why did you go from 10 iterations to 3 iterations? He said, because we don't have any more time. And then they just, of course, made the iterations longer. So that's pretty. But in the end, in Rivendell, in Lord of the Rings, there was a lot of discussion about what they should do and who should be part of it and how difficult it would be. And then Frodo stands up and he says, I'll take the ring, even though I don't know what I'll do at all. So this little frightful Frodo, he's saying, okay, I will be the servant leader. I will try to do something about this project. I'll do whatever I can do. So he's being very nice about it. And Gandalf is stepping up and he's saying, all we have to decide is what to do with the time that is given us. And to me, that sounds a bit like agile development. It sounds a bit like sprint planning. We just have to figure out how much we can put into this sprint. That's all we need to do. And if we look at Gandalf, he actually has a very interesting way of being a manager. So Gandalf is setting a vision. He's setting a goal. He is motivating the people in the team. And then he is expecting the team to be completely autonomous because he disappears. They don't know where he is. They don't know what he's doing. They don't know when he's coming back. Suddenly he pops up again, doing something for them. He disappears again. They think he's dead. They can't get in touch with him. He's not answering his phone or anything. They don't know what's going on. Then he pops up again, taking responsibility, taking the honor, fixing things. I've actually worked with a leader like that once, and it was interesting, I would say. Some of you might have worked with a leader like that. It gives you a lot of freedom, but it's also a little bit exhausting because you don't know when they'll be there, and you don't know what kind of support you'll have. Now, there's a different management style in Lord of the Rings. And I don't want to come up with any examples, but I can tell you that Sauron is a different kind of management. He is not believing in a vision. He's just telling people what to do. He has created OKRs, and they're just trickling down into the system, no questions asked. He's telling people, you can get a promotion, you can get a lot of money, you just have to put this little ring on. So they're given this mobile phone, and they can't shut it off in the weekend, and all this middle management, or the Nazguls in this case, they have to do exactly what Sauron wants them to do. They can't think on their own. They often write together in big hordes, which is not very efficient. They're not allowed to think on their own. I don't know if they can do it, but they're not allowed to do it. And also Sauron is very happy about remote meetings, where you're a little bit worried about who's actually listening in on the meetings. You don't know who's part of the meetings, and suddenly Sauron is there. He didn't say he'd be there, but he's suddenly there, telling you off about something that you've said or done. So Sauron is quite a different manager. And I once worked in a company. I will not say which one it was, but it was an old tele company in Denmark. Danish people will know what it is now. And they wanted to be agile. But I said, okay, this is interesting. Of course, when people want to be agile, they send a lot of people on a Scrum course, so that's what they did. And then they expected to be agile, and they were wondering why they weren't agile. So they called for me, and it's like, okay, well, let's look at it. And so they had this horde of Nazgul, or middle management. And these people, they were told by the big boss what they should do. And they were really worried about doing it wrong. They didn't have any autonomy. So whenever I asked this person about something, he said, wait a minute, I have to ask this person, and I have to ask this person, I have to ask this. They had to go all the way up to Sauron every time. Even when I was preparing a course, and I was making slides, and my slides looked like this, and everybody had to accept the slides. They had to accept that the things that I would say would be okay, and I said, but if you look at the slides, you don't know what I'm going to say. But everybody had to look at the slides anyway, which is completely stupid. And then also they said to me, well, of course, when you want to introduce Agile in an organization, you're saying that everybody should hear about it. Yes, I said, not just the developers. Everybody in the leading hierarchy should hear about this Agile mindset and the Agile ways of working, because otherwise it won't work. We won't get the right investments. We won't get the right way of working. And they said, great, well, all 20 managers in this part of the building, they can be put on your course. Great. I said, my course is 2 days. I said, that 2 days is a little bit too long for management. Let's say 1 day. I said, that's fine. I can probably squeeze the important parts into 1 day. And they said, well, it turns out 1 day is not, it's not possible. Can you do it in half a day? I said, well, yes, okay, I can do it in half a day. I think I can get the most important things into half a day if I have half a day with them. And then they said, actually, they only have an hour. And I said, this is not good enough. But okay, I'll do it. And on the day when I was supposed to teach these 20 people for an hour, they showed up half an hour late because they had a very important meeting, and they had to leave 10 minutes before, and there was actually only 10 of them that showed up. And when they were sitting there, they were on their computer the whole time because they had some very busy email things that they had to work with. So even though everybody wanted to know everything, they didn't really want to know anything at all. And that's how I see Sauron. Wants to know everything, but doesn't really want to know how the orcs are feeling about what they're doing. He's never asking that. Some of you might have worked in a Sauron organization. Some of you might have worked in a Gandalf organization. And if any of you are managers, you should consider whether you want to be Gandalf or Sauron or something in between, perhaps. So there's also this thing about being cross-functional. So you can say that our little team here is cross-functional. But there's this myth about cross-functionality in Agile, where people are saying, well, if you're a cross-functional team, everything have to be able to do everything. And they can't do that in this team. Gimli can't run. The hobbits are trying to learn to fight with swords, but their arms are so tiny that people have to actually lean in to get killed by them. So they're not cross-functional in that way, but they're cross-functional in the right way, in the intended way, where all the functionalities are in the team at the same time. They can actually manage to fulfill this project because all the functionalities put together is enough. Another thing that I want to talk about is when they're moving together, they have to figure out where to go. And the obvious way to go is to use the passage south. That's what Gandalf says. We will use the passage south. It quickly turns out that Saruman, who's working for Sauron, has his spies everywhere, so they can't use the passage south. And Gimli is saying, we should use the mines of Moria. Nobody's really listening to him right now, probably because he's tiny. And Gandalf is saying, we should use the pass of Caradhras instead. So that's going over the mountains. And Gimli is saying, we shouldn't do that. We should use the mines of Moria. And everybody's saying, yeah, you're going on with your mines of Moria. We're using this pass of Caradhras. And then when they're walking there on the cliffside, the weather becomes terrible. There's snow everywhere. And Saruman starts to break down the mountain so that it falls into their heads. And they have to go back, and they have to go through the mines of Moria, which of course makes Gimli extremely happy until he notices that everybody has been killed in the mines of Moria, and it's filled with orcs and trolls, so it's not as pleasant as he thought it would be. And to me, that's a bit like when we're discussing what technology to use. There'll be some people who really thinks Mines of Moria is fantastic because they used it 20 years ago, and it's useful for everything. It's a fantastic technology. Then there's some technologies that are obvious, but then when you try them, obviously they're not so good. And the Pass of Caradhras is also interesting because it seems to be the rationally good solution, but it turns out that there's some things that are not working. But they're going back, which I think is great, because sometimes when you have to decide what technology you're using, you're falling into this sunk cost fallacy, and you're saying, okay, now we walked on the mountain, we can't go back, we have to move on. So this is the technology choices. Now, another thing I'd like to talk about is psychological safety. Because when they are in the mines of Moria, the little Took is making a lot of noise, which wakes the orcs and the trolls and creates a very nasty situation, and Gandalf becomes really mad with him and says, "You fool of a took, throw yourself in next time and then you'll be no further nuisance." And this is not really psychological safety, I would say. Also, they have a problem, even though it's a very diverse team, they have a problem with inclusion. We hear everyone say, men are weak, and Gimli is saying, never trust an elf. So they're not really nice to each other. It's a culture clash, but it's also a question of being very nice to each other. So there's there's talk about throwing the dwarf and making people run who can't run. It's not a very nice place to be, really. And I think that they could have worked a little bit more with the psychological safety. And we have to say that even though it's a very diverse team, you've spotted it, right? It's 9 white blokes. So maybe not so much. And they're not having any retrospectives. They're not having. Yeah, you might be laughing, but this is serious business. They're not having any retrospectives. They're not listening to how other people are feeling about what they're experiencing now. Nobody is listening to Frodo when he's talking about what he's experiencing with the ring. They're not talking together, which turns out to be also a little bit of a blessing in disguise, because is it Merry or Pippin who gets in contact with Saruman in that remote meeting, and Sauron is really trying to go into his brain to find out everything he knows about the project. And luckily, he doesn't know anything. So maybe it's good that they don't have retrospectives after all. So they have this team, but then at some point, they have to split up the team. And one of the reasons why they have to split up the team is because bad things are happening. Now we have the Nazgul, the orcs, the trolls, and the Balrog, and some of these things were predicted. We knew that there would be orcs, we knew that there would be trolls, but Nazgul is a bad surprise, and Balrog is an even worse surprise because it turns up there in Moria, so it doesn't feel very good. And when I'm thinking about these things, it's like what we see right now is suddenly there's a lack of funding, suddenly you can't hire any more people, you have legacy systems, maybe you have a vendor system you have to work with, or there has been a board meeting where somebody has been called out. So there's all these bad things that can happen that can break a team or discourage them. And another thing that happens is that Frodo feels the power of the ring. He can suddenly feel how wonderful it is to have the power of the ring. And you can see here that he's have this weird smile, and it's becoming more and more dangerous with this project. So he took on the responsibility a bit reluctantly, but at times he likes the power and he doesn't want anybody else to be in power. And this is actually what gets Boromir killed, because Boromir feels the power as well and wants to take this power. And in that battle with the ring, they stir up a lot of evil things, and Boromir disappears. So Merry and Pippin saves Frodo, and in turn they get caught by the orcs. And Frodo and Sam are leaving together to put the ring into the hot stuff to end the project. And that means that we split up the team, and that's actually not necessarily a bad thing. There are some things in Heidi Helfand's book about dynamic teams, about when a team starts, when a team has to split, when a team has to change. She has described some patterns, and one of the patterns is the grow and split pattern. And in her book, when she's describing the grow and split pattern, she actually has an example from a lady called Rachel Davies that worked at a company called Unruly. And in that company, when they had to split a team, or at least at one of the times when they had to split a team, she baked a cake, and then she cut the cake in pieces. And as you can see here, they used actually Lord of the Rings as an example for that, where they say we have to cut the cake so that Sam and Frodo is one part of the team, and then Aragorn and Legolas and Gimli is another part of the team, so that the other part of the team gets this cake. So they're celebrating that we have to split the team instead of mourning it, instead of being unhappy about it. And one of the companies that I worked with also did this split. First they had component teams, and then they split the component teams into project teams so that everybody in the same team was working on the project, and now they've split the project teams into component teams within the project teams, and then they have communities of practice outside. I'm not saying that's necessarily a good idea, but that's what's happening. And what it made me think about was team topologies. I'm sure that many of you know what team topologies are. How many of you know what team topologies are? How many of you would be able to explain the different 4 team topologies right now? Right, okay. That is why I have this example, because it's only a few people who can do it. I hear so many people talk about team topologies, but I think we need a really good example of team topologies. So one of the teams that you create in team topologies is the stream-aligned team. The stream-aligned team can also be called the product team. This is the team that is delivering value to the users. We could say that Sam and Frodo is the stream-aligned team, right? They're moving on with the ring. They are delivering value to the customers. Now then we have the enabling team. The enabling team is helping a stream-aligned team to overcome obstacles. It detects missing capabilities. They're experts in a specific area. They have the muscle and the skill set that the stream-aligned team does not have. Obviously, that is Gimli, Aragorn, and Legolas, right? They're fighting the fights because they've got longer arms and stuff like that. So these are the enabling team members. Then we have the complicated subsystem team. The complicated subsystem team is where we need significant mathematics, calculation, or technical expertise. Maybe you need a PhD, maybe you need many years of experience. People in a complicated subsystem team cannot take part in a stream-aligned team because we normally don't have that many experts. They're going around visiting the stream-aligned teams. And obviously, Gandalf is the complicated subsystem team, right? Because he can do magic things. Now, the last team is called the platform team. It is a grouping of other teams, and it provides an internal product to accelerate the delivery by the stream-aligned team. They have a strong focus on developer experience, and they help other developers become better. They see the other developers as customers, in a sense. And this is where the analogy breaks down, because I could only see Merry and Pippin being a little bit like a platform team, in the sense that in the beginning of the adventure, when they hear that Sam and Frodo needs to go to Bree to meet Gandalf in the Prancing Pony, they choose to move along to help them. But they don't really have a lot of particular skills, but they are helping, they're trying to be nice. Now, I wanted to give this example because now I think you'll never forget the 4 different types of teams in team topologies, correct? Yeah, thank you, somebody nodded. Now, when you hear presentations about team topologies, what the authors, whose names escape me right now, what the authors are saying is that one of the things that makes them create these team topologies is because they have this cognitive load in the teams. So a team can have a cognitive load, which is everything that this team must know about, so the skill set, the status, and it can become too much, and then maybe you have to divide this team into these different team topologies. Now, the way that I know about cognitive load theory is because I'm teaching teachers how to teach computer science at the university. Actually, at the moment, I'm teaching the next teacher how to teach computer science at the university. So it's very meta. And the way that I think about cognitive load is when I'm teaching, and when I'm teaching these teachers, it's about how many things should you actually put into a presentation, how many things should you put into an assignment, how many different concepts should you talk about when you have a session with somebody who needs to learn something. The cognitive load theory was created in 1982 by John Sweller. And the simple way of looking at it is like this graph. So we have the cognitive load, how much you're saying, on the horizontal axis, and you have the learning outcome on the vertical axis. And it's no big surprise that the more you say, the more you teach, the higher the learning outcome becomes. But the interesting thing, which might be counterintuitive and definitely is for a lot of university lecturers, if you've ever been to one, is that at one point you have a sweet spot. And if you continue to talk about new things, if you continue to introduce new concepts after the students have hit this sweet spot, the learning is actually deteriorating. It's not just stagnating, but you're ruining what you already told them. Because the brain is so cognitive loaded, the brain is busy trying to take the things from the working memory and put them into the long-term memory as patterns and schemas. But if you continue to talk, they will learn less than if you shut up. But that's not something that teachers like to hear. So John Sweller made this fancy theory so that they could learn about it. Let's go into details about this. So the cognitive load actually consists of 3 different things. The first one is the intrinsic cognitive load. The intrinsic cognitive load is the smallest amount of information that you need in order to explain a subject, the smallest amount of information that you need in order to make meaning of a new concept. You cannot reduce it without reducing understanding. The next part of the cognitive load is extraneous cognitive load. An extraneous cognitive load is a non-intrinsic cognitive load that interferes with rather than contributes to learning. So this is extra information that you tell people that are actually confusing them more than it's helping them. The last part is the germane cognitive load, and the germane cognitive load is a non-intrinsic cognitive load that contributes to the learning rather than interferes with the learning. And you can think about this as maybe if you're explaining something like with patterns or with schemas, you are helping people trying to understand and trying to remember these things. So what you want to do is that when you want to figure out how much cognitive load you have in a presentation, you add everything up. And some of it all fills into the cognitive load, but some of it is helping and some of it is hindering. So what you want to do to optimize the learning is to minimize the extraneous load and maximize the germane load. But if you're looking at this slide, then what part of this is the extraneous cognitive load? Any ideas? What's on this slide that's making you more confused? Yes?
Yeah, it's probably the year of birth for John Sweller.
Definitely, yes. It's the year of the birth of John Sweller. That's not really helping you understand the cognitive load theory. Maybe even the picture of John Sweller is not helping you very much. What about intrinsic cognitive load? Which part of this is intrinsic cognitive load? What is it that you cannot reduce without reducing the understanding? The graph? What about the germane cognitive load? Yeah?
The acronym, IEG.
Yeah, the acronym. And the interesting thing about one of you saying that the graph is the intrinsic and the other one saying that the acronym is the germane cognitive load is that it could be the other way around as well. People have different preferences for how they want to learn things. To some people, the graph is sort of the intrinsic cognitive load. This is the thing that they need to understand, they need to see in order to take it in, because they take it in as a picture or a diagram. And on the other hand, other people are more verbally based, more verbally preferenced when it comes to learning, and they want to take in the text in order to learn this. So you can say that the intrinsic and the germane cognitive load can sometimes be a little bit interchangeable. Now, this is what I wanted to say about cognitive load theory. And I know that I haven't spent all the time yet, but I want to finalize this talk now. What is it we should have learned from the Lord of the Rings story? Nothing. It's just a fairy tale. It doesn't have anything to do with software development at all. I just wanted you to listen and look at some nice pictures. There's nothing you could have learned from this. I've had a chance to talk about my experiences, and maybe you got something out of this, but we should be very, very careful about thinking that we can learn anything from things. It might be a way to listen to it because it's more interesting to hear it in this way, but take my word for it. We human beings are far too interested in listening to successes and wanting to replicate the successes. And of course, with every presentation that I've made, instead of making a presentation, there's always just an SKCD I could have shown instead. And this is 1827. Some of you already know what it is I'm talking about, right? It's the survivor bias. Let me just read this while I take a sip of the water. Because when we see people who succeeded, we should be very careful about thinking that we could do exactly the same as them, and be very careful about saying that we should do exactly the same as them. If we're looking at the things that happened in the Lord of the Rings, they didn't have psychological safety, they didn't have retrospectives, they had very poor management, they didn't have a lot of cross-functionality where they're teaching each other anything. They didn't have much pair programming. Nobody learned a lot from each other. They had a nice time and they finished the project, but it might not be enough. So that's actually what I had. I know that I said that I wouldn't have time for questions, but we can also just take the questions over the drinks afterwards. And of course, I want to plug my book. Yeah, so please buy my book. You can also buy it on Amazon in Australia. But I also have one book to give away here. So the first one to come down here and ask me a question after the talk will get this free version of my book. So thank you so far, and perhaps there are questions. You should clap now.
Do we have any questions?
All the way on the other side. I'm sorry about that. Yes?
Matthew Skelton and Manuel Pies.
Thank you. Matthew Skelton and Manuel Pies. Thank you. Are the authors of the team topologies.
Hello, Aino. Thank you very much for that. My question is, which is your favorite character in The Lord of the Rings, and why is it Sam?
Sam is such a nice fellow. He really wants to support Frodo, and he can be hard when it's needed, and he will give him all his food when it's needed, and he sees through Gollum's deceit. So Sam is a wonderful figure. I also like Aragorn for other reasons. He's Danish. What were you thinking? Are there any other questions?
Wave your hand, shout. Okay, then please join me once more in thanking Dr. Corry.